He was the most powerful man in the empire, yet he moved like a prisoner of his own skin. He refused to sit on his throne. He padded barefoot across marble floors. He ordered courtiers never to touch him. Why? Because he believed his body was turning into glass. A single embrace, he thought, could splinter him. A careless shove might shatter him into dust. To survive, he ruled with terror. Guards were executed for brushing against his robe. Servants vanished for reaching too close. He ordered silence in the halls, for even a loud sound might crack him. And yet he wielded absolute power. His armies marched, his ministers obeyed, but his mind had turned his palace into a glass prison. Every step he took was a ritual of fear. Every day was a war against an enemy only he could see. The question that haunted those who served him was not how long his empire would last, but how long glass could bear the weight of blood. They called him Charles. To the world, he was an emperor. To himself, he was something far more fragile. The delusion began quietly. He complained of a strange pressure in his chest, a tightness in his bones. He spoke of feeling hollow, as though his ribs were glass panes and his heart a fragile sphere. Physicians examined him, but found nothing wrong. Yet Charles grew convinced his body was no longer flesh. It was crystal, delicate, and breakable. At first, his attendants humored him. They laid cushions along corridors. They cleared sharp objects from his chambers. They watched him pace barefoot, convinced that shoes might grind his glass toes to shards. His fear was absurd, but harmless, until the day he struck his first victim. A servant, rushing in with a message, brushed his sleeve against the emperor's arm. Charles froze, his face drained of color. He screamed that the touch had cracked him, that his arm would splinter. In a frenzy, he ordered the guards to seize the servant. Within the hour, the man was executed, his body carried away in silence. Charles stood trembling, clutching his arm, convinced he had survived only by spilling blood. From then on, touch became a death sentence. Anyone who laid a finger on him, even by accident, was doomed. Guards learned to keep a full pace's distance. Ministers bowed from afar. The throne room became a hollow stage, the emperor alone at its center, ruling from a cage of invisible glass. But Charles's fear grew sharper. He refused to sit, convinced that pressure would crack his glass spine. He paced endlessly, night and day, barefoot across the palace floors. He forbade doors from being slammed, for he swore vibrations might fracture him. Even laughter unsettled him. Too sharp, too loud, too risky. Those around him whispered of madness. Yet none dared say it aloud, for Charles had turned fear into law. The physicians returned, trying once more to soothe him. They explained that glass was fragile, yes, but his body was not. They pointed to his strength, his unbroken skin, his steady heartbeat. But logic had no place in his mind. He shouted them down, declaring that their ignorance threatened his life. 2 physicians disappeared that week. Their families never saw their bodies. The court grew silent. Ministers learned to speak in whispers, their movements slow and measured. Every moment became performance, every gesture a calculated effort to avoid death. The palace became less a seat of power than a morgue waiting for victims. And yet Charles believed himself a survivor. To him, his empire's silence proved that his caution was justified. Each execution was not cruelty, it was preservation. Each death was a shield protecting him from shattering. He told his closest attendants that they should be grateful to die, for their sacrifice allowed the emperor to remain whole. But outside the palace, the empire stirred uneasily. Soldiers muttered that their emperor had gone mad. Nobles whispered that his paranoia weakened the crown. Merchants complained that his fear slowed decrees, stalled decisions, strangled trade. The empire was bleeding, while its emperor obsessed over cracks only he could see. Still, Charles clung to his delusion. He ordered new rules. No mirrors in the palace, for he feared to see his glass reflection. No heavy furniture near him, for a toppled chair might shatter him. No sudden movements, no laughter, no sound above a whisper. He built a palace of silence, and he ruled it with executions. And yet, even as he silenced others, one question haunted him. What if the shattering came from within? What if, one day, his glass heart splintered and no one could stop it? That terror drove him deeper into madness. And it was only the beginning. Charles no longer ruled as a man. He ruled as a fragment, a brittle shape in constant danger of breaking. Every morning began the same. Attendants laid strips of silk across the marble so the emperor could walk barefoot without risk of splinters. He moved slowly, deliberately, each step a ritual. He refused chairs, refused beds, refused even the embrace of his own family. He stood for hours, trembling, as if the simple act of existing was a trial. The palace became a stage for his paranoia. Guards were posted not to protect him from enemies, but to protect him from touch. Ministers kept distance when they bowed, their voices low, their gestures restrained. A single wrong move, a stumble, a raised tone, A sudden motion could mean execution. The silence grew oppressive. Courtiers learned to mask their breathing. Servants trained to move like shadows. Every action became rehearsed, careful, rehearsed again. The court no longer revolved around the empire. It revolved around the emperor's fear of shattering. And still, the rules multiplied. Charles ordered that no one enter his presence carrying books, scrolls, or anything with sharp edges. He demanded the palace floors be covered with carpets, fearing a fall would smash his fragile body. He forbade horse rides, carriage journeys, even simple walks beyond the palace walls. The empire became a cage, and he its trembling prisoner. Yet fragility became power. Those who feared him most were also those he ruled most effectively. When a minister hesitated to enforce his will, Charles accused him of plotting to break him. Within hours, the minister's family was executed. When a general warned of rebellion, Charles accused him of trying to shatter the empire's glass crown. The general's head rolled, and the army bowed. No one could argue with a ruler who claimed every word, every gesture, every doubt was a threat to his very life. His paranoia became justification for tyranny, and his delusion became the most lethal weapon in the empire. But madness is never content with control. It must grow. Charles began to hear sounds no one else could hear. Tiny cracks, like the fracture of a pane beneath pressure. At night, he woke screaming, convinced his chest had splintered. Servants rushed in, only to find him alive, trembling, demanding proof that his ribs were still intact. He ordered physicians to examine him again and again. Some dared to say he was whole. They disappeared by dawn. Others learned to nod, to lie, to agree that, yes, there were fractures, but he remained unbroken. The emperor's nights stretched into endless pacing. He wandered the palace barefoot. Silk mats stretched endlessly before him, muttering that the walls might collapse if he touched them. Candles burned until morning, for he feared the dark might hide the moment of his shattering. His attendants never slept. To serve him was to exist in exhaustion, waiting for death with each trembling step. Outside the palace, the empire began to rot. Laws went unsigned. Decrees stalled for months. Soldiers were left unpaid. Nobles quarreled in the provinces, while the emperor obsessed over his imagined fragility. But none dared move against him. Even whispers of rebellion died quickly, silenced by fear of what Charles might do if he sensed a threat. And yet a strange thing happened. His madness spread. Courtiers began to mimic him, shuffling carefully, avoiding loud voices, tensing at sudden movement. They began to fear fragility as much as he did. Ministers confessed in whispers that sometimes they too felt brittle, hollow, fragile. His delusion had become contagion, infecting those who lived too long in his silence. The emperor who believed he was glass had turned his empire into glass. But cracks always grow. One day a guard stumbled. His sword clattered to the floor, echoing through the silent hall. Charles froze. He screamed that the sound had shattered his legs. In a frenzy, he ordered the guard's execution. Not only the guard, but his entire family. Men, women, children, all killed to preserve his illusion of safety. The message was clear. The emperor's body was fragile, but his wrath was unbreakable. And as the bodies piled higher, the question that no one dared ask became unavoidable. What happens when an emperor who thinks he is glass finally convinces the entire world he is right? The emperor no longer ruled a kingdom of men. He ruled a kingdom of silence, fear, and ritual. Every day in the palace became a procession of precautions. Silk mats were rolled across every hallway. No one was permitted to wear shoes in his presence. Servants carried no trays of metal, no dishes of glass, no weapons of any kind. Even the candles were replaced with lamps of clay, for Charles feared a shard might strike him if a flame cracked its holder. He ordered the throne itself to be removed. A chair, he claimed, might shatter his spine. In its place stood a padded dais where he paced endlessly, day after day, issuing decrees through trembling lips. To see him was to see a man consumed not by enemies, not by age, but by the terror of his own bones. And yet his fear became law. He demanded that every official swear loyalty not only to the crown, but to the preservation of his fragility. They were to serve not just an emperor, but a man who believed a single touch could kill him. Failure to respect his delusion was treason. Doubt was death. Ministers learned to bow from a distance. Guards learned to move like shadows. Even family members were forbidden to approach. His wife, his children, his blood, kept at arm's length as though they were daggers poised to strike. They saw him only as a trembling figure in the distance, a phantom in silk robes, pacing barefoot on endless mats. And yet, distance did not protect them. One night, Charles accused his own nephew of betrayal. The boy had dared to laugh too loudly in the corridors. Laughter, the emperor insisted, carried vibrations that might splinter his glass ribs. The boy was executed before dawn. His parents followed, accused of raising a son who mocked fragility. By morning, an entire branch of the royal line was erased. The message spread. The emperor's body may have been fragile, but his wrath was unbreakable. But fragility is hungry. It devours everything around it. Charles began creating rituals to preserve himself. Before every council, attendants were forced to strip naked, proving they carried nothing sharp. Before every decree, a sacrifice was made. A servant executed in silence, blood spilled as an offering to whatever unseen force he believed guarded his glass form. At night, priests were summoned to chant, not prayers of God, but prayers of protection, begging the heavens to shield him from cracking. The palace floors were covered in layers of straw, walls were draped with heavy cloth, windows were sealed, for even the sound of rain might unsettle him. The once great palace had transformed into a tomb of silence, muffled and suffocating, designed not for glory, but for paranoia. And beyond its walls, the empire began to collapse. Merchants cursed the endless delays. Generals raged at orders that never came. Soldiers deserted, left unpaid and restless. Crops withered in neglected fields, while the emperor obsessed over cracks only he could hear. In the provinces, whispers of rebellion grew. Nobles conspired in shadows, wondering if fragility itself might be their chance to seize power. Yet none dared strike. For Charles's madness had become more dangerous than reason. He ruled not with armies, not with laws, but with the unpredictable terror of a man who believed every gesture threatened his life. His fragility was not weakness, it was weapon. And as fear tightened its grip, the emperor's delusion deepened. He claimed to hear the sound of breaking glass in his dreams. He awoke screaming, swearing his body had fractured in the night. Servants rushed in, only to be met with rage. "You caused this! Your breath, your footsteps, your laughter, it has cracked me." They were dragged away. Few ever returned. One physician, desperate, told him the truth, that his body was strong, that he was not glass, that his fear was an illusion. Charles stared at him for a long moment. Then, with a voice trembling with fury, he ordered the man shattered, bones broken with hammers, body crushed until nothing but fragments remained. The emperor stood over the corpse, whispering, "This is what I would be, without fear." From that day on, no one spoke against him again. But whispers grew among the people. They said the emperor had cursed himself, that by believing he was glass, he had made it so. Not in flesh, but in spirit. They swore they could see the reflection of candlelight flicker unnaturally on his skin, as though it truly were translucent. Some claimed they saw his shadow bend and splinter, a jagged silhouette cast on the walls. To his people, Charles was no longer a man. He was a monster, fragile, yes, but untouchable, indestructible in his madness. He had turned his own fear into immortality, and still he ruled. But cracks were forming, not in his body, but in the empire itself. Nobles sharpened their knives. Generals plotted in silence. The people whispered of revolt. The empire was bleeding, starving, dying, all because one man feared a touch. The question was no longer whether Charles would shatter. The question was whether his empire would collapse before he did. The empire had learned to move in silence, but silence breeds secrets, and secrets breed betrayal. The ministers bowed, the generals saluted, the servants obeyed, but in the shadows, whispers grew. They had seen their emperor pace barefoot across silken mats, trembling at phantom cracks. They had watched their peers executed for laughter, for clumsy stumbles, for daring to breathe too near him. They obeyed out of fear, but fear cannot last forever. Some ministers began to meet in private, their voices low, their words careful. They plotted not to overthrow him, but to survive him. They spoke of hiding grain from the imperial stores, of securing alliances in the provinces, of preparing for the day when fragility could no longer hold the empire together. But treachery is never truly hidden. One night, Charles called a council. His eyes were sunken, his hands trembling, his feet bare and bleeding from endless pacing. He accused half the ministers of betrayal. He named them without proof, declaring they had mocked his fragility, wished for his shattering. Panic spread through the chamber. Some fell to their knees, begging for mercy. Others shouted in denial. None of it mattered. By dawn, their heads adorned the palace gates. The executions did not restore loyalty. They spread terror and despair. The ministers who remained understood the truth. Their emperor no longer needed reasons. His fear was reason enough. His delusion was law. But outside the palace walls, revolt stirred. Provinces starved under neglect. Soldiers deserted in waves. Farmers abandoned fields, fleeing taxes they could no longer pay. Merchants closed their shops, their goods rotting in silence. And still, Charles raved about cracks only he could hear. His madness deepened into ritual. He demanded his attendants hum softly as he walked, believing the sound masked the splintering inside his chest. He forced guards to smash pots in the courtyard, declaring it was better to break clay than to risk breaking him. He sacrificed servants at random, swearing their deaths kept fractures from spreading in his body. The empire bled, while its emperor waged war against an enemy no one else could see. But even those closest to him began to falter. His wife begged to see him, to hold him if only once. Charles refused, screaming that her touch would kill him. His children were kept at a distance, growing up as strangers to their own father. Some said they wept not for his love, but for the empire he was destroying. The court was no longer loyal. It was waiting for the moment the glass cracked, not in his body, but in his rule. And that moment came sooner than anyone expected, for the empire beyond the palace had grown louder than the silence within it. Nobles raised armies. Provinces closed their gates. The people whispered of rebellion, louder and louder, until whispers became shouts, and shouts became cries for war. Charles believed he was glass, but his empire had turned to dust. The empire could no longer bear its silence. Whispers had grown into shouts, shouts into rebellion. Provinces rose in defiance, nobles raised their banners, and soldiers who once marched beneath the imperial crest now turned their blades against it. The empire cracked, not with the sound of steel, but with hunger, rage, and despair. Inside the palace, Charles raged. He ordered walls draped thicker, floors padded deeper, silence enforced harder than ever. He screamed that the rebellion outside was not political, not human, but part of the great conspiracy to shatter him. The armies were not fighting the crown, they were fighting his bones. And so his paranoia grew sharper than any sword. He summoned priests and forced them to chant day and night, voices shaking, begging heaven to hold him whole. He demanded sacrifices before every decree, servants strangled, guards executed, blood spilled in silence, as if their deaths stitched cracks in his invisible shell. His hallways echoed not with laughter or law, but with the thud of bodies dragged away. But rebellion does not pause for madness. As armies drew closer to the capital, the palace itself became a prison. Charles no longer trusted his ministers, his guards, his family. He accused his wife of plotting to shatter him in his sleep. He banished his children, swearing they carried betrayal in their blood. He executed generals who dared bring him reports of defeat, insisting they had invented lies to break his fragile spirit. Every betrayal was imagined, until betrayal became real. Servants vanished in the night, deserting their posts. Guards abandoned the gates, slipping away to join the rebels. Ministers poisoned documents, forging decrees in his name to stall his commands. The empire was no longer his. It was eating itself alive, piece by piece. And still Charles paced barefoot across silken mats, trembling, muttering that he must not fall, must not break, must not shatter. His fear had become the only throne left to him. The rebels closed in. The palace shook with the sound of battering rams. Torches lit the night, fire pressing against the walls. The silence that had once been law was drowned out by the roar of war. Charles collapsed in the middle of his chamber, clutching his chest, swearing he could hear it, his glass heart splintering, his ribs cracking like pains beneath pressure. He screamed that the empire itself was breaking with him, that his body and his kingdom were one. And in that moment, it was true. For as his fear consumed him, so too did the empire collapse around him. But the rebels did not find a shattered corpse when they stormed the throne room. They found a man still standing, trembling, barefoot, eyes wide with terror, a figure who believed, until his final breath, that he was made of glass. The rebels expected to find shards. Instead, they found an emperor still breathing, barefoot, trembling, eyes wild with terror. He stood in silence as soldiers stormed his chamber, their blades drawn, their torches blazing. He raised his hands, not to fight, not to beg, but to protect himself from an imagined crack in his skin. "Do not touch me," he whispered. "I will break." Some mocked him, others pitied him, but none could forget the figure before them, the most powerful man in the empire, reduced to a prisoner of his own body. And yet, was he truly defeated? The empire shattered that night. His armies dissolved, his banners burned, his crown was stripped away. But the madness he carried, the fear of fragility, did not die with his reign. It lingered, whispered in taverns and courts alike. People spoke of leaders who could not be touched, of rulers so fragile they would kill to protect illusions. For Charles's curse was never truly about glass. It was about fear. Fear so sharp it ruled stronger than iron. Fear so deep it demanded blood. Fear so consuming it convinced an entire court, an entire empire to bow to a delusion. And when fear rules, it does not matter if a man is made of flesh or bone or glass. He will kill, and others will die, all to preserve a lie. So the question is not whether Charles was mad. The question is whether his madness was unique. How many rulers since have cloaked their fragility in violence? How many leaders still tremble at cracks only they can see? How many empires have bled, not for power, not for war, but for the illusions of one terrified man? Glass shatters in silence. It needs no enemy, no army, no blade. It breaks from within, from pressure unseen. And perhaps that is why Charles feared so much. Perhaps in some way he was right. For in the end it was not steel, not rebellion, not fire that destroyed his empire. It was fragility itself. And if one man's delusion could bring down a kingdom, how many more kingdoms wait to fall, ruled by those who mistake fear for strength and weakness for power? Remember this: glass does not have to break to kill. It only has to convince you it might.